this is one of the most important lessons that Christ will give as he has been giving what we call the Sermon on the Mount. He has taken a lot of time to go into great details as he has taught some very valuable and some very important lessons throughout this sermon. There's been many practical and extremely important things that have been taught concerning, and this is the important part, the life of a Christian. If you're going to be a Christian and you're serious about being a Christian, then the Sermon on the Mount will help you to achieve just that. He deals with everything from our own attitudes, our own personalities, to how to be a light to the world. He in salt of the earth. He deals with the boundaries of sin. You have heard this, thou shalt not do these, but I'm saying unto you. And he draws that line a little more strict. And so he's basically letting us know if you were serious about Christianity and you're serious about following Christ, then here are some things that you can apply. And so Christ has spent a lot of time going through those throughout this sermon. And he deals with living holy. He deals with avoiding sin. He deals with having the right relationship with others and many other truths that he gives throughout this sermon. But what makes this text so important, I believe, is that in our text, Christ is taking some time and letting them know that not every person who claims to be a follower of Christ is a follower of Christ. Not every person that claims to be teaching God's word is teaching God's word. Not every person who stands and says, I am a prophet of God, not every person who comes to them and says that is going to truly be a prophet of God. And so he takes some time to give them this warning. Not everyone who says, I'm a messenger from God or a follower of Christ, not everyone is truly those things. And he is going to let them know that there will actually be people who teach contrary to what Christ has just taught. And they're going to come in the same name. They're going to say, I'm here under the name of God and as a follower of Christ, but they're going to teach something contrary. And so he's going to give them some warnings about this, and he lets them know some people will try to mislead them. Some people will change truth. Some people will even try to lead them astray. And so you've got to be careful and take heed to the warning. This warning is extremely important because in their desire to grow, and please don't miss this, in their desire to grow and in their hunger to learn more. And we're talking about new Christians here. They want to learn more, they want to know more, and they want to be better Christians. And in their desire to grow and in their hunger for truth, they have to be careful of what source they go to for that truth. Or even though they desire to grow, they'll find themselves not growing at all, but rather even becoming stagnant if they're not careful. So they must consider carefully who they allow to influence them spiritually, because people are not always what they say they are. Has anybody found that to be true? People are not always what they say they are. So in our text today, we take a look at this warning, understanding that these warnings are still relevant today. Very important. I want to get right into it this morning. We start off in our text looking at the introduction to the warning. In verse number 15 and even the first line of verse number 16, he makes his very first statements about this warning. Now he's going from teaching and explaining some things, and then he jumps right into with this word in verse number 15, beware. And so he starts off not really sugarcoating it, not really approaching it cautiously, but rather he's going to mention some things that are important for every genuine Christian with a heart for the truth of God's word. Here are some things you need to know. And he starts this warning off with the word beware. Here's what I want us to notice in the introduction to the warning. We notice first of all that the claim is very serious. Beware of false prophets. It's not sugar-coated, it's not hidden, it is not made to look pretty. He simply says, beware of false prophets. I'm not going to say this in a way that will mislead you. I'm going to say it very pointed. Beware of false prophets, he says. People are not always what they claim to be. People are not always wanting what they say that they want. What people say is their motive is not always their true motive. It is not always their true agenda. So he says there are false prophets, and he says beware of them. Don't be intrigued by them. Don't go to them for ideas. Don't make them your mentors. Beware of them. There is a great warning that is given here. I've approached many houses, and at the fence before the sidewalk, there is a sign that says, beware of the dogs. I don't always see dogs, but I never go through the fence. I'm just not interested in finding out what's hiding under their porch. And when you're from Arkansas, a lot of things hide under porches. So we see the introduction to the warning. He lets them know that it is very serious. Be careful when they are around. Beware. Be on look. Be on watch. Keep an eye on them. Don't trust them. Beware of false prophets. And now this would be real easy. I was thinking about what must have been going through their mind as Christ was explaining this. And the truth is, it would be real easy if they wore a name tag that said false prophet. Well, that'd be easy, wouldn't it? I mean, false prophet. When I see that sign, beware of the dog, I know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a dog. But if that sign just says beware, I don't really know what I'm looking out for. And so here he says, beware of false prophets. So we know what we are to watch for, but how do we identify them? They don't wear a name tag that says, I'm a false prophet. Beware of me. Watch out for me. I'm going to try to deceive you. They don't announce that. And so it's a very serious warning. In fact, Christ not only tells them that the claim is serious, but in this introduction, he also warns them that the deception is effective. They're very good at what they do. Look what he says in verse 15. First, beware of the false prophets which come to you in sheep's clothing. They are deceptive. The deception works. The deception fools people. I don't think we have to look very far in our history and even across our country to see false prophets have followers. The deception works. The deceiving is effective. It fools people. And here's the interesting part I find in this verse. He says, they which come to you. You don't even have to go to them. They'll find their way to you. And they'll come to you through social media. They'll come to you through YouTube or videos or television. They'll come to you through your friends. They'll come to you through your coworkers. And they look like they have the joy of the Lord. It's so deceiving. They look like they have the joy of the Lord. They look like they are living in the blessings of God. And they sound like they are worshiping God. And they sound like they are teaching God's word. They are extremely deceptive. Why? Because they come in sheep's clothing. You can't look at the false prophet and say, oh, there's a false prophet. You can't, because they come in sheep's clothing. It's easy to reject Buddhism. Why? Because they're not coming in sheep's clothing. It's easy to reject Hinduism because they're not coming in sheep's clothing. It's easy to reject Islam. Why? Because they're not coming in sheep's clothing. But Christ had warned them about the false doctrine of false religion. He warned them about that separately. But now the warning is about those who come in the name of being part of the fold of God. I am a sheep like you're a sheep. I'm a follower of God like you're a follower of God. I am a son of God like you're a son of God. We're all worshiping the same Christ. And so they don't come under a different God and a different name. They come under the same name. And he says, these are the ones you must really beware. Their deception is effective. Hence we have the beginning word of the warning, beware. He then goes on to give the reason for the warning as he warns us that the intention is hidden. Verse number 15, he says, beware of them. They're going to come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. The intention is hidden. They come in sheep's clothing, but they're not sheep. Now remember, this is Christ as he's standing and teaching the multitude, and he's just given them some extremely important lessons, and he's letting them know, everything I just told you, there will be other people who try to teach you something different. And they may even come under the same name of serving God and following God, but if their message is different, then they're not following the same God. And so he gives them this warning. He says their intention is hidden. They claim to be from God, but they have their own agenda. They claim to be teaching the ways of Christ, but they have their own motives. So how can we know who these false prophets may be? Beware of false prophets. Okay, I've got that. Well, how will I know them? Well, you can't look at them and tell. They come in sheep's clothing. Matter of fact, they'll come to you. They'll join you. They'll come to your groups. They'll come to your house. They'll come into your church. They'll come into your life, and they'll come to you, and you will be convinced, if you're not careful, that they are just like you. He says you've got to beware. But inside, well, how can we know them? Well, not by their name tag. We figured that out. Not by their own words. Not by their own testimony. Because if you listen to them, they'll tell you they're one of you. So not by their own testimony, not by their own words, not by a name tag they're wearing. So how can we tell? Well, he gives them this in the first part of verse number 16. Ye shall know them by their fruits. You shall know them by their fruits. One of the most distinctive differences between a true follower of God and a false follower of God, or in this case, true prophets, false prophets, is the outcome of those who follow them. Now, we think of fruit of the Spirit, individual fruit. The fruit of the context here is the fruit of those who follow that particular leader. What do the disciples look like? What kind of life are the disciples living? Who are the followers of this prophet? Because if you just listen to the individual, he's serving the same God. He's serving the same Jesus. He has the same Bible. Everything is the same. He says, and you'll not know them by their names. You'll not know them by their words. You'll not know them by their own testimonies. And so you have to go beyond that, and you have to look at the fruit. And so he says, by their fruit, ye shall know them. In verse number 16, ye shall know them by their fruits. This leads us into the fact different trees produce different fruit, and then he gives us the precaution of the warning. After he gives us this really pointed warning in verse number 15, I don't think anyone could say that is a sugar-coated verse. Beware of false prophets. They come in sheep's clothing, but inside they're ravening wolves. I mean, that's pretty pointed. Then he gives us some precautionary warnings here, I believe, starting in verse number 16. So there are false prophets who look like sheep, and the Christian must be aware. He must be on guard. And the precautionary question that Christ presents encourages us to know what we are looking for. Look at verse number 16. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? So this is the warning that he's giving you. This is the question that he's giving them. And he is saying, do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? What kind of fruit do you want to be? What do you want your life to end up as? Do you want it to be fruit or do you want it to be thorn? Do you want it to be figs or do you want it to be thistles? And so he gives them this challenge to know what it is you are looking for. Don't look at the tree, because the tree can be deceptive, but look at the fruit. Don't be impressed by the beauty of the tree. What kind of fruit does the tree have? Don't be so shallow spiritually, and please get this, don't be so shallow spiritually that you are so impressed by the tree that you fail to notice the thorns and the thistles. Oh, but it's such a marvelous tree until you get close. Oh, but look how the tree is growing. Look how healthy that tree looks. Look how wonderful that tree looks. And you get so enamored by the tree that you don't even see the danger of getting too close to the tree. He gives us this precautionary. We have to know what we're looking for. If you'll look past the sheep's clothing, past the smooth and the enticing words, and look at the fruit, then you can make better decisions for yourself. Once you know the fruit is bad, that is, it's a tree of thorns and this is a tree of thistles. Once I know that, then how much insanity would it take to think I can get good fruit from that? If all the other fruit is thorns and all the other fruit is thistles, we don't go to that tree for apples. We don't go to that tree for fruit. We stay away from that tree because we see what that tree produces, and it is not what I want in my life. And if I don't want it in my life, then why would I go there to be fed? Why would I go there to be encouraged? Why would I go there to grow spiritually when I know there is no spiritual nutrition in that tree? We must know what we are looking for. If you don't know what you want in your life as a follower of God, then you'll find yourself looking at all the trees and saying, that tree looks good, that tree looks good, that tree looks nice. And you're never inspecting the fruit of that tree. But you have to know what you're looking for. The second thing, we must also trust God's plan. Verse number 17. Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot, he's going to repeat this, a good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Now let's back up and look again at what he's talking about. He's saying, if you will follow, remember the warning he gives at the end of this sermon, he that hears these words and does them is like a man who builds his house on the rock. The storms come, but he stands firm. But he who hears these things and does them not, that is, you don't go to the good tree. The one who hears these things and does them not is like a man who built his house on the sand. The winds came, the rains come, the winds blew, and great was the fall of that house. So now he's letting them know every good tree will produce good fruit. In other words, if you will do what I have just laid out, it will work in your favor. But if you think some other way is the best way, whether it's of your own thinking or the leading of somebody else, you're going to find yourself not where you want to be. So we have to trust God. We have to trust God's plan. God's plan is a good tree, and it will always produce good fruit. Any other plan would be considered a bad tree and will never produce good fruit. Here's the problem with many in Christianity. We think we can go to bad trees and somehow produce good fruit. And it cannot happen. Now let me just clarify this. You can go to bad tree and still have good people. You can have moral people, you can have kind people, you can have loving people. But the fruit that he's referring to is the product of following God's plan. You can never follow a different plan and end up with the product of following God's plan. It cannot happen. So we have to trust God's plan. God's plan of salvation will always produce salvation. Always. Any other plan will never produce salvation. God's plan to forgiveness will always produce forgiveness. Any other plan will never work. God's plan for worship is always worship. But any other plan is never worship. And so he's making it very clear to them, here is the right way, and if you'll do this, it will always be the right way, and it will produce a Christian that is pleasing to God. Good fruit of following Christ, good fruit of following God's will, good fruit of following God's word, following God's plan. This is the good fruit. That's what we want to be. But he says you cannot come to this tree and get that fruit. Oh, you can look like it. You can look like the sheep's clothing. You can put on the front of the rest of it, but you'll never truly be the fruit that God can make you. So what do we have to do? We have to trust in God's plan. God's plan for marriage will always work. Always. But when an outside interference, an outside tree starts getting into that marriage, it's not going to work. God's plan for raising children always works. But you raise your children following a different tree, it's not going to work. It will not work. And so he's giving them a very serious warning that these things that I've taught you, hold on to them. Don't let somebody else come in, because he knows it's going to happen. They're going to come in and they're going to say, I'm a follower of God too. Oh, I believe in Jesus too. I read the Bible too. But I mean, come on, you really don't have to live like that. Whoa. If you don't really live like that, you're not going to end up fruit like that. It can't happen. So you've got to follow the right tree. So we have to trust in God's plan. We don't always see it working, but we trust that it works. Following a ravening wolf will never turn anyone into a clean sheep. Cannot happen. And if that was too deep for you, let me break it down. Wolves do not give birth to sheep. It's impossible. So we trust God's plan. We trust God's way. We trust God's Son. We trust God. And going into verse 18, we see a bit of repetition. Christ wants to remind us again to inspect the fruit, and you will discover the root. Inspect the fruit, and you will discover the root. If I want to know what kind of tree is in my yard, I have two options. I can take a sample of the tree and give it to somebody smarter than I and have it tested. Or, this is my preferred method, Brother Don, I can look at the fruit of the tree, and then I know. I've got a little illustration here that I think will maybe help us to reinforce what we have already kind of heard here, I guess. I found pictures of some trees. The first one is a tree. Now there may be somebody here who knows what kind of tree that is, but I couldn't tell you. All right, then there's another one. All right, that's another tree. Looking at these for me and trying to decide what kind of trees those are is about as crazy as me looking at somebody's life and deciding how great of a Christian they are. So I can do this, or for the first tree, I can come back and say, I'm going to look at the fruit. Does anybody know what kind of tree it is now? That's an apple tree. That was a lot easier, wasn't it? Or I could go to the second tree, and I could just look at the fruit, and I could say, oh, that's an orange tree. That was a lot easier for me. The truth is, I could spend all day. In high school, I had this class where, anybody have that class where you had to go find all the leaves? And you had to, put down all the traits of the leaves and find out that was the, matter of fact, I'm going to give a confession. I cheated on that project. They wanted like 100 leaves. I was in Mackinac, Illinois. We only have 2 trees. They wanted all these trees, find the leaves, find all these things, and put them down. So here's what I did. My best friend ended up being the best man at our wedding. He did his project the year before. So I said, hand over the project. It had a little front cover page. Just pull that out, put a new one in. Tom Gibson. Ta-da. He got a 98. I got an 84. Didn't change a thing, so it didn't help me any. And then I felt bad, and I told the teacher. No, I didn't. I'm just kidding. Truth is, if we're not careful spiritually, we'll look at the personality of the leader. And this happened to Paul as well. He had some people coming in with their smooth words, enticing words to the churches he started, and started deceiving them. And if we're not careful, we'll find how smooth and how slick somebody is, and we'll find ourselves being swayed to follow them. When the truth is, if you want to know what your life will end up like, don't look at the person leading, look at the people following them. Because that is the fruit. If you want to know really what a Christian ought to look like, find somebody who's really following the Lord. And that's the fruit. And he gives us some things in the fruits of the Spirit, what that would look like. We notice we cannot look at the outside of a man and know what kind of fruit he will produce, so we must look at the fruit. Let me give us thirdly and lastly, we notice in this text the judgment of the warning. Think of verse number 19. He lets them know Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Remember, he's talking about people coming and claiming to be followers of God, but they're not. These people are obviously not Christians, not followers of God. That's how they get the name false prophets. And he says their judgment is coming. They'll be cast down. God will take care of them. They will be handled. They will be taken care of. God will handle them. We see sheep clothing, but God sees the wolf. We can be deceived by convincing words and warm personalities, but God has never been deceived. God will not be deceived. God does not take their deceit lightly even. In fact, it turns out God does not take too kindly to false prophets trying to deceive the sheep of God. And he says their judgment is coming. God will take care of them, which leads us to know how we ought to respond to false prophets. We'll go back to chapter 5. We won't go there for time's sake because you'll remember it. Verse 29 and verse number 30. Remember what he said about if thy right hand offend thee. Cut it off. If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. Well, now when it comes to the false prophets, he says God will take care of them. And so it leads us to believe, what are we to do if there is a false prophet in our life? We remove it. We don't allow it to influence. We don't go there for our source of comfort and for our spiritual food. I'm not going to go to thorns and thistles for spiritual growth. And so if that is what is being produced, if that is the fruit of that tree, it doesn't matter how magnificent the tree looks. I don't want to end up there. I don't want to end up there. So he gives the warning to them, but also it's instruction to us. If they are not of God, get rid of them. If they're not producing godliness, don't let them influence your life. If they're not showing forth the fruit that is fit for Christ, then get rid of them as a spiritual advisor in your life. Don't give them that place. And then verse number 20, I think we see the heartbreak of the false prophets. It's a very simple verse in verse 20. He simply says, wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them. Now, there's no doubt he's simply reminding them, don't get your eyes on the prophet, but look at the fruit. Because the prophet's going to be in sheep's clothing. But here's the heartbreak for me. The sad reality in this verse is this. Though there may be judgment, it doesn't change the fact that they already have fruit. They have followers. Even today, think about this, even today there are people who are being deceived about their own eternity because somebody else has created or fell in line with some other form of salvation. And there are people today that are standing up and speaking in tongues because they think that will get them to heaven. And the rest of their life, they're going to think that heaven is their home because they followed a sheep in wolf clothing. And you could go on and on with the different spiritual rituals that go on in churches, all under the name of Christian. Vance Havner said, if you broaden the definition of a word, eventually the word no longer has definition. And then under that he put the word Christian. Our world has so broadened the word Christian that we really don't even know what it means anymore. It can mean this. It can mean baptismal regeneration to some. It can mean lifestyle lordship salvation, as they call it. If you didn't totally change everything, then you didn't get it. It can be say a prayer. It doesn't matter what you think. It doesn't matter how you feel. Just say this prayer and you're in. It doesn't matter what form it is in. There are people all over saying, no, this is Christianity. No, this is Christianity. No, this is Christianity. No, this is what it means to be a Christian. And the lost person is so confused they don't know where to turn. Because all these people are claiming to be sheep. But which one is right? So Christ gives them the warning, beware, beware. For your sake, beware. For your children's sake, beware. For your marriage's sake, beware. For your family members' sake, for your friends, beware. Because there are a lot of people who come in the name of sheep's clothing that do not preach God's word the way God intended it to be preached. You know, it's real easy sometimes to try to think of some creative, neat story to go along with. You know, how creative can we get? How neat can we make our 3 points in a poem to a message? The truth is, sometimes God's word is just a warning. Beware. Because if you don't want to end up as thorns and thistles, then don't follow those who produce thorns and thistles. But if you want to be fruit, godly fruit, then find you a place that is producing godly fruit. And sit under that and trust God's word. Trust God's word that it'll do a work that only it can. Heads are bowed and eyes are closed this morning. I started off the service by saying that this could be argued as one of the most important lessons that Christ will give. Let me explain why I say that. If you are deceived, then what will you be teaching your children? And what will they be teaching your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren? See, truth is, this is something that could impact not just you, but your entire family tree. If you give in to the wolves, what will your children look like? God help us to stay faithful and true to God's word and trust good trees produce good fruit. God, I don't understand it, but I'm going to trust you. God, I don't see it necessarily the way I should right now, but I'm going to trust you. Because I want to be the good fruit.